Okay, let me start over. This is the 19th Sunday after Pentecost. This is also my 15-year anniversary at Aloha Church of God. And for those of you who think that's a good thing, I appreciate that very much. I'm a little surprised that my good friend Fred Douglas came this morning just for the anniversary. And Craig and Mary came home especially this week for the anniversary, and Greg and Peggy, they delayed their trip so they could be here for this anniversary. That's just very meaningful to me. 15 years is a long time. I prayed hard for a church with low expectations. And I just appreciate it so much. Hey, how many of you have heard a good sermon from Zephaniah recently? Micah's got his, what does the Lord require from you to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? And Amos has his, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. But there are no really good Facebook memes or bumper stickers from Zephaniah. But he still has some important things to speak to Judah as well as to us. And today our teaching is titled, Is God Sleeping? And I'm not going to answer that just yet. But first, Annie and Clyde had just gotten home from church. And Annie asked Clyde, did you see that new tattoo Jennifer was sporting this morning? Clyde responded, I didn't even see it. And Annie continued, and that outfit Lucy had on, don't you think that skirt was a little short for a mother of two? And Clyde said, well, I didn't notice that either. And Annie said, well, for heaven's sake, a fat lot of good it does you to go to church. Do you ever feel like God must be sleeping? Like he doesn't see what you're going through? Like he doesn't see how unfair life can be at times? It's kind of that same attitude that I often say, where is a cop when you need one, when you see someone else go through a red light or they pass you really fast speeding down the highway? Sometimes we wonder, when is God going to get revenge on all the bad things that have happened to us? And of course, that's assuming that we're the ones who are suffering from life's unfairness. The flip side is when we think we can get away with murder, and I'm using that word in the hyperbole sense, because God either doesn't see or doesn't care, or at the very least won't do anything about it. And that's kind of what we're looking at today in the book of Zephaniah. And we're going to read Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 7 through 12. I'm going to ask you to stand, and if you would read this with me, I would appreciate that. Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated those he has invited. On the day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish the officials and the king's son and all those clad in foreign clothes. On that day, I will punish all who avoid stepping on the threshold, who fill the temple of their gods with violence and deceit. On that day, declares the Lord, a cry will go up from the fish gate, wailing from the new quarter, and a loud crash from the hills. Wail, you who live in the market district. All your merchants will be wiped out. All who trade with silver will be destroyed. At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent, who are like wine left on its dregs, who think the Lord will do nothing, either good or bad. Their wealth will be plundered, their homes demolished. Though they build houses, they will not live in them. Though they plant vineyards, they will not drink the wine. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thank you. Please be seated. Last week we looked at the prophet Amos, and this week we're examining Zephaniah. And when we're talking about the Old Testament prophets, we know that back in the day there was Samuel and Elijah and Elisha, but they didn't really write anything. Most of what we have about them is stories, a narrative about the things they did and the people they interacted with. And then starting with Isaiah, we have the writing prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are considered the major prophets, or sometimes just the prophets. And in the Christian Bible, next comes Daniel, but Daniel isn't located with the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. It's more with the writings like Psalms and Ecclesiastes. And then after Dan, in our Bible, comes the minor prophets, 12 of them, from Hosea to Malachi. And in my very first year here, I preached a series called Digging for Treasure with the Minor Prophets. And as you know, my sense of humor has not improved since then. But when we refer to Hosea, Joel, Haggai, Zechariah, and all the rest as minor prophets, we're not implying that they're less important than Isaiah and Jeremiah. They're simply shorter. Whereas Isaiah required its own scroll and Jeremiah required its own scroll, all 12 minor prophets fit on one scroll, hence the minor prophets. Well, it helps to know the context for a prophet's message. Last week we found out that Amos was from Judah, but he was preaching to Israel during the reign of Jeroboam II. And Israel was at its peak economically, militarily, and in their prosperity, they had a real problem with justice, treating the poor and the oppressed better. So Zephaniah preaches to Judah during the reign of King Josiah. Josiah was the last good king of Judah before the exile. The 4 kings after Josiah came by in rapid succession over a period of just a little over 20 years as Judah just rushed toward exile to Babylon. And Josiah, who is one of my favorite kings, that's why my younger son is named Will Josiah Irwin. Josiah was only 8 years old when he became king. He was 16 when he began to seek the Lord. And when he was 20, he instituted a reform in Judah. Kind of a revival took place from the top down in Judah, getting rid of the idols and the Baal worship. Josiah was uniquely devoted to God. I like what we read about him in 2 Kings. Neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength. Does that ring a bell from anywhere? In accordance with all the law of Moses. And when Josiah was 26, his high priest Hilkiah was overseeing a renovation of the temple, and reported to Josiah that he had found the book of the law. And this may not have been the complete Torah, or the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I think more scholars think this was probably the book of Deuteronomy. And some people even think that Hilkiah wrote the book of Deuteronomy. But think about the time that King Josiah and the prophet Zephaniah lived in. Josiah's grandfather, Manasseh, was the most evil king Judah had ever had. Ammon, Manasseh's son and Josiah's father, was no better. So Josiah was the son and the grandson of 2 evil kings. But what was it that prompted him to seek the Lord? It wasn't finding the book of Deuteronomy. He started seeking the Lord before that was ever retrieved from the temple. But what was it that led to this sea change in Josiah's life? The inciting event that led to reform in Judah. Well, enter the prophet Zephaniah. No extra charge for this, but the first verses of Zephaniah tell us that he was the great-great-grandson of Hezekiah. And while it doesn't prove it was the king Hezekiah, it's kind of like, well, Hezekiah wasn't a real common name, and why would they even put that in there unless it was King Hezekiah? And Hezekiah was also Josiah's great-grandfather. And so what we find out here is that King Josiah and the prophet Zephaniah were second cousins once removed. And if you understand all that first, second, third, and especially the removed part, you're smarter than I am. But under Manasseh and Ammon, the previous 2 kings of Judah, the kingdom had kind of gone to hell in a handbasket. And the first year of Josiah's reign, while he was still a child, they probably weren't much different. But verse 1 of Zephaniah tells us he ministered during the reign of Josiah. But the prophet depicts a nation very unlike the kingdom of Judah subsequent to Josiah's reforms. From the Judah that Zephaniah describes, it would seem he's preaching to the kingdom early in the reign of Josiah, before his reforms, which just makes me ask, could Zephaniah's preaching in Jerusalem have been the catalyst for the change that took place in Josiah's life? I don't know, but it's good to imagine the possibilities. Zephaniah describes a Judah in which the poor and the oppressed are exploited by the rich, where people worship the false gods of other nations, and above all, where day in and day out business goes on as usual, and no one worries about the possibility of divine intervention. No one is worried that God might show up and do something about it. The prevailing attitude is, well, God doesn't see, or God doesn't care, at least not enough to get involved. And Zephaniah describes this as his people thinking, the Lord will do nothing, either good or bad. But this coin has 2 sides. The head side is when the haves think they can, with reckless abandon take advantage of the have-nots. It's like, what are you going to do about it? Who's going to stop me? And we've all seen movies or read books where the rich and powerful get away with murder, and I don't mean that in the hyperbole sense this time, knowing that no one is going to stand up to them. And all we have to do is follow the news to see that all too often the rich and the powerful do act with impunity in how they treat the impoverished and the vulnerable. On the other hand, the tail side of that coin is when the poor and the weak, those who are being oppressed by others, sometimes by individuals, sometimes by systems and powers over which they have no control, sometimes they feel like God doesn't see what they're going through. God doesn't care what's happening to them. And most of all, they believe that God's not going to do anything about it. Yesterday, Palestine attacked Israel. And all the news shows, I couldn't sleep last night. So at 6 o'clock this morning, I was listening to the radio. And they were talking about what brought us to this point. And last year, 2022, 204 Palestinians were killed by the Israelis, and 22 Israelis were killed by Palestine. And I am not excusing by any means what's going on today in Palestine, but I don't know of a worse feeling than being kicked when you're already down and having no recourse, the inability to do anything about it. And sometimes people who think God doesn't care or that God doesn't see, they feel the need to retaliate because their thinking is that no one else is going to come to their defense, so they've got to do it. Now, to the haves, the ones who lord it over the have-nots, Zephaniah writes, neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. And Zephaniah speaks a little more indirectly to the have-nots, those who are being oppressed. He says, God is saying, I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent. And this is an assurance to the poor about their oppressors. And I'm going to take the liberty of paraphrasing that, where God says, I'm going to light a lamp and search every dark corner. The abuser may think I don't see, but I'm coming, and I see what's going on. You know, the title of my sermon today is God Sleeping? And Zephaniah doesn't actually use that phraseology. He just says the people are saying God isn't going to do anything. Well, I'm trying to be a little creative with my title, and I cannot think about the idea of God sleeping without reviewing in my mind the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. When Elijah challenged the Baal prophets to a contest to determine whose God was real, the prophets of Baal whipped themselves into a frenzy, trying to get their God to set their sacrifice on fire. And Elijah taunted them. Shout louder. Maybe he's deep in thought or busy or away on a business trip. Maybe he's sleeping and you gotta wake him up. Well, if we think God is sleeping and doesn't notice or care about the evils we inflict on others or the injustices others inflict on us, we're dead wrong. And for those times we're hurting, and wondering if God needs a sharp elbow in the ribs to get his attention, the psalmist writes, "He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." And the prophet Zephaniah, when he says the prevailing wisdom of the complacent is that the Lord will do nothing, either good or bad, he's basically saying that just because you've gotten away with murder up to now doesn't mean that your comeuppance isn't already in the works. And he tells about the coming day of the Lord when everyone will get their just deserts, because God is watching and God does care. Now, when Zephaniah talks about the day of the Lord, he takes on an almost apocalyptic tone, but he's not talking about the end of the world, but a day when God intervenes on behalf of the poor. He's probably talking about the coming invasion by Babylon and the exile to follow. Lots of Old Testament prophets use that day of the Lord language, and they don't always mean the same thing. It's language that can adapt to different scenarios. Most of the time, it's referring to a coming military action. Often, it's the Babylonian invasion. Well, what did Jesus say about God seeing and God caring? I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm going to take something out of context, and that's something we're not supposed to do. But 3 times in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus refers to God as the Father who sees what is done in secret and how he will reward you. Now, he's talking about showing kindness to the poor, praying and fasting. But I think a fair takeaway from that is that God sees what is done even when we think it's secret. Whether someone is doing to or for us, or whether we're doing to or for someone else, God sees it all. We might even say he takes notes and he remembers. And when we fail to believe that God has our backs, we feel like we have to fight back. Sort of like what's going on between Israel and Palestine this morning. It's like if we don't get satisfaction, no one else is going to get it for us. But that's antithetical to what God says. It's not our place to exact vengeance when someone wrongs us. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, "It is mine to avenge. I will repay." And that's God speaking in Paul's writings. Now, we can be wrong in 2 ways. Personally, I have been wrong in way more than 2 ways. When we think God doesn't see when we get hurt, or when we think God doesn't see when we hurt other people. Both are wrong. God is not sleeping. God sees and God cares. When we trust that God is on our side, we're okay with leaving the consequences to him and letting him take care of things. Let's pray together. Father, you have never let us down. We can say with Joshua that every promise has come true. Let us trust in you to have our backs so we can bless those who curse us and pray for those who despitefully use us. and not feel like we've got to get revenge for the wrongs done to us, but that we can leave that to you. That's up to you, God. When we hurt others, you see. When we get hurt by others, you see. You never sleep. You never slumber. Amen.